Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth video in the New Teams Onshape introduction series. In this video, I'll be discussing some of the important parts of in-context modeling that I picked up from the Onshape learning pathways or from using them in the accumulator assembly. This particular branch of Onshape is one that's very different from Creo. It's absolutely assumed that you've seen the Onshape videos about it, because there are definitely things that you'll miss if you haven't seen them. With that out of the way, let's get started. So in-context modeling is Onshape's name for assembly level modeling. For the most part, assembly level modeling should be avoided to reduce the number of chain dependencies we have within our assemblies. However, for many things, assembly level modeling is absolutely necessary. An example of this is a wiring loom, which may run from one enclosure along chassis rails in through the firewall and into another enclosure. So it has to reference all of those separate documents and assemblies, and therefore it can't be modified without access to these external items. So that's a perfect opportunity to use an in-context relationship. The complex graphic that I've got in front of you now is basically like a quick rundown on whether you should use in-context relationships or not. Feel free to bring up this video and use this as a reference if you're struggling. Alright, so the first important tip is that contexts are not a live version of the assembly that they represent. It's just a snapshot in time from whenever you created the context. So for example, this is the connector box from the accumulator. This is the assembly itself. I've got the part studio down here where I created the box, lid, and gasket. So you can see now I can go to the assembly context and everything shows up there. If I go into the connector box assembly and I hide certain parts, maybe all of these HV lines, hide all of those, go back to the connector box, you can see that they're still there. So I actually have to manually update the context in order to get them to be hidden, or any changes that I made in that assembly to be reflected in this part studio. So this is good. It means that if someone else is working in an assembly that you are using for an in-context relationship, any changes that they're making won't keep popping up and showing up whenever you don't want them to. You can elect to either keep it exactly as it is, or you can make the changes that you need in the assembly, update your context, and then other people are free to do whatever they want. It can also be really beneficial if I needed to work on something specific and I didn't want all of this other stuff getting in the way. I can hide certain components until I'm happy that I've kind of got the minimum amount of parts shown. And then A, that means that I've got a lot more visibility in my assembly, and B, it can also really speed up Onshape within your browser if you don't have a million parts and assemblies all floating around in your context. You are able to use more than one context in each part studio. So the connector box that I've got here is a good example of this. You can see that I've got two contexts, one for the accumulator assembly and one for the connector box assembly. So in the accumulator here, there's the connector box there. I'll show you a section view to make it a little clearer. So I obviously had to use the first context to kind of get the external geometry correct, make sure it was all the right shape and size and everything like that. And then in the connector box assembly itself, I had to place this current sensor, and it was moving around quite a lot to try and get the bend radius of these cables correct. So it was quite a variable part. That with all of these connectors and their placements, that's why I had the secondary context as well, so that I could model these holes and I could model these little standoff stays and this hole down here as well. Onshape will try and do a couple of things to make sure that the in-context relationships you have don't slow down your browser too much. So you can see that everything that is actually visible from the top surface is shown with quite clear quality, but everything underneath that you can't actually see but exists somewhere in the assembly is kind of badly tessellated. That being said, it's always a good idea, as soon as you don't actually need the context anymore, just exit out of it to speed up your modeling and make sure that your browser isn't lagging too much. So you're able to create an in-context relationship from a part by right-clicking and hitting Edit in Context. However, that depends on the notion that the part already exists in the assembly that you want to create the context from, and this is not always the case. If I'm trying to create a brand new part within this assembly, obviously I can't right-click it and hit Edit in Context, so I have to use the button up here, Create Part Studio in Context. So the interesting thing about this is I can select either the origin of the assembly, which is down here, or any mate connector that I want. So in theory, any of these would work. However, it can be intelligent to use the origin of the assembly as the origin of your part studio as well. That's because if I create a part that has, some weird or difficult geometry, if I choose the origin of the assembly as my part to the origin, when I insert that difficult part, it'll get inserted in the correct position within this assembly. The caveat with that is that it's not actually fixed in place in any way. It is kind of just floating in the correct position, and then you'd either have to mate or group it. Now, obviously in this scenario where I'm dealing with quite a difficult part, we'd have to group it. But as I said in the assemblies video, grouping in any high level assembly is a really bad idea and you should avoid it. However, this is a low level assembly, so I'll kind of show what this would look like. So I'm going to select the origin there, accept that. All right, now I'll jump into modeling this part. All right, so I've modeled that part, which is a pretty nonsense part, but you can see that if I wanted to mate this particular part, it'd be pretty difficult. There's not much geometry that I could snap it to in the assembly, but if I go insert and go to assembly, I'll choose that part. You can see that it actually snaps to the position that I modeled it in, and that's only because I chose the origin as the Part Studio's origin rather than any one of these mate connectors here. But you'll also notice, as I said before, that this is not fixed in place. I can click and drag it out, and if this is the scenario that I want it to sit in this exact position, then this is a good application for the group tool. So I can group that to the current sensor, and because this isn't a high level assembly and I'm not going to be inserting other things into one of these sub-assemblies, it should be fine. Anyway, that's all the tips that I've got for in-context modeling. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video.